to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here, and hope that there's some people filter in as they find us. But I really appreciate you being here this morning. I think this CLE should be very good. It'll be a good chance to really start talking about a lot of the changes in the landscape of the criminal law. That we're going to talk about 10 Bill 70, which I can't articulate another reform in the criminal law that has had that much impact since I've been practicing law, which is only 13 years, so I may have missed some things, but I really think that this whole seminar is really set up to prepare you for the changes that are coming in the practice of criminal law, both on the juvenile side and the adult side. So this morning we'll be focused primarily on the juvenile side. This afternoon we'll switch focus toward the adult side. And our first presenter this morning is Ms. Heidelberger. She's the statewide JDI coordinator for the Unified Judicial System. Prior to that, she was the JDI coordinator in Pennington County, which is one of the pilot sites for JDI. And she's really spearheading the expansion of that initiative statewide. Liz graduated from Blackhill State University and has worked with the Department of Corrections and the Department of Social Services before starting with DJS. And so please join me in welcoming Liz.
Hear me okay? I move my hands around a lot, so I can't hold a microphone. So, first off, I'd just like to know how many of you have heard about JDI before? How many of you have been involved in juvenile proceedings? How many of you have argued for or against detention? And then, how many of you have participated as a youth in not so positive behaviors? Or positive on the youth end, maybe? Okay. I won't ask what. What do you think?
Getting caught or not getting caught?
That's not up to me. My question, yes. Just in general. The Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative is through the Annie Casey Foundation and started in Portland, Oregon in 1992. It started during the age of the super predator. They had a very high number of kids incarcerated, which caused some pretty scary conditions in their detention center. And they also had a high number of people that had the lock them up and throw away the key mentality. So they really, Portland, Oregon is a pretty progressive site, and they worked with the April CLE Foundation to create what is now called the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. Basically, the whole vision of JDAI is to establish a more effective and efficient system for kids. How do we treat these kids the way they need to be treated, and how do we ensure their due process rights? As you can see, here's the vision, vision, purpose, and objectives. It's all about eliminating the unnecessary and inappropriate use of detention. It's all about making sure that we minimize the failing to appear rates. We look at the racial and ethnic disparities, concerns that we do have in our state, and we look at improving the conditions of secure detention, all while redirecting public finances towards things that make sense versus a stay in detention. The values of JDAI, this is probably the biggest reason why South Dakota took on JDAI as a process. JDAI is not a program, it's a process. It's a way of thinking, it's a philosophy change. It changes, somebody that's working with juveniles, it changes their entire world. For the better, hopefully, because it does better for kids. So that first one, serving the right kid at the right place at the right time. It's hard not to agree with that. It's hard not to want to have their best for kids and hope for the best future that they can possibly have. And serving the kids in the least restrictive setting available. Some of the issues that we have in South Dakota is that we're very rural. So when a law enforcement officer comes into contact with a youth, they can either take them home or hold them in detention. And there's not very much in between. So JDAI, and one of the reasons why South Dakota sought out JDAI, is because we can make it our own and we can be creative. Really, honestly, the two pilot sites probably had a harder time than the new sites will have because they had detention in their back pocket. They could drive across town versus have 2 deputies drive a kid to somewhere that's 4 hours away. Another one of the values is reducing racial and ethnic disparities. As I noted, we do have this concern in our state, and through the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, it's actually one of the 4 core requirements. So it was one of the things that kind of attracted South Dakota to JDAI to help with that disproportionality as well. And then again, establishing programs to be effective and efficient. Probably the number one thing about JDAI truly is the data. You have to link everything back to the data. What makes sense, what doesn't, and that's why JDAI in each site, Pennington County, Minnehaha County, or any other count of the 66 counties, the JDAI will look different. It won't be the same, it won't be implemented the same, but as long as you follow the core requirements of JDAI, you'll have a system change. Here's the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group dashboard. In the top left corner, here's a map of how many sites are currently working on JDAI, either as a local state site or a county site. And then there's also model sites as well. The indicators right here show felony petitions filed have decreased. The number of juvenile arrests have decreased. The number of delinquency petitions and the juvenile intake cases have decreased. This is what the 2 pilot sites in Minnehaha County and Pennington County have also experienced. Along with the average daily population at the bottom has also decreased. And that has happened in South Dakota as well. This is probably one of my favorite slides. It goes back to the have they been caught or have I not? 86% of the longitudinal study, 86% of the kids that were interviewed said they had been committed an offense, whether delinquent, chins, etc. And only 34% of those kids actually had an arrest, actually were caught, actually went through the system. So 52% of those kids said they did something, but they never went through the system. And that's because most kids age out of their behavior on their own. The system, sometimes if you widen the net, sometimes you're dealing with kids that would have never needed any sort of intervention and would have been completely fine on their own. And detention leads to worse outcomes. I don't know if you can see that white right there, but there's a lot higher risk of kids to drop out of school, to use alcohol, and to use drugs. Anybody have an idea of why that happens with kids that were in detention versus kids that weren't? What was that? Exposure. Right, yep, exposure, absolutely. Yeah, and then the stigma that comes from being in detention. You go back to school and the kids say, oh, you were in juvie this weekend, and you start kind of gravitating towards the maybe not so positive behavior kids than the positive behavior kids, no matter how we were before you went into juvenile detention. This slide talks about the reductions in the disproportionate minority impact on the top left. As you can see, the national trend, the trend is that more kids are coming into contact with law enforcement and being incarcerated as a national trend, in a JDAI site that's actually going down. And that's because JDAI really has one of the focuses of racial and ethnic disparities reduction. And also on the right, this is actually about DOC commitments, permanent correction commitments. It does reduction of reliance of incarceration, but it's actually a decrease of the kids that are committed to the permanent corrections long term. And South Dakota is actually also seeing that reduction as well. And at the bottom, I talked about fiscal savings, and that's not really savings, it's really reallocation. This is about, you don't have as many kids in secure detention, but it's reallocating a lot of those funds, a lot of those people, sometimes, FTEs, to alternatives to detention programming. So it's using the same amount of money, but getting more bang for your buck, so to speak. The functions of secure detention. So the kids that we want in detention are the kids that we're scared of, not the kids that we're mad at. That is a philosophy switch from one of the chief court service officers that has embraced JDAI across the nation. The kids that we want in detention are the kids that we want to prevent from reoffending because they have a demonstrated risk of reoffending on a delinquent act. The CHINS offenses on a daily basis aren't a community safety issue for the most part. And then we want to make sure they go to court so we don't have to set them up to fail to appear and have a warrant out for their arrest and have to stay in detention. And also, just to make sure that detention isn't for the kids that we just want to keep safe, but sometimes you have to make that decision if that's all you have as an option. So it's one of those things that you put those kids in there and you just hope and pray that they don't talk to some of the other kids that are committing a more serious offense. The whole goal of JDAI and one of the things that South Dakota has really embraced is we want to make sure that the kids that are stealing a candy bar aren't sitting right next to the kids that steal a car. Because logically speaking, the kid that steals a candy bar isn't going to learn or is going to learn from the kid that steals the car, not vice versa. The kid that steals the car isn't going to say, hey, how'd you steal that candy bar? No, that's not going to happen. The kid that steals a candy bar is going to say, hey, how'd you steal that car? So we're actually teaching them things while they're sitting in detention. Now in regards to JDAI in South Dakota, the Annie Casey Foundation was actually sought out by the Council of Juvenile Services, which is a governor-appointed committee and has been in place since 2003 as a requirement of the coming into compliance with the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. It's also called the State Advisory Group on a national level. Historically speaking, in 2006, 2008, and 2010, I don't know if you know this, but South Dakota had the highest incarceration rate in the nation. The next in line is Washington, D.C. So obviously we are not at all similar to Washington, D.C., both in size or demographic. So South Dakota did not want to continue to be known as having the highest incarceration rate and really the lowest serious offender rate at the same time. So we had a lot of kids that were sitting in detention for low-level offenses, probation violations, aftercare violations, and things of that nature. So the CJS met with Stephanie Vetter, the Annie Casey Foundation, in the end of 2009 to have the Annie Casey Foundation give their pitch. And obviously, since I'm standing right here, they said yes. And it's been a collaboration ever since. They chose the two pilot sites in Minnehaha and Bennington County because they both have regional detention centers. And they really wanted to see if this would work and to see if this was worth continuing on a sustainable level. Again, since I'm standing right here, obviously that in 2013, the Council of Juvenile Services really told the two pilot sites, we want to continue to support you, but we really want to have you identify a sustainability plan. Because the whole goal of the Council of Juvenile Services is to identify programming, help them for a few years, get it up and running, and then move it on to a sustainable agency. And that sustainable agency was the UJS. And that made sense because the UJS's whole goal and purpose in juveniles is re-education. And that's really what the JDAI is all about. It's about the kids from the time they come into contact with law enforcement until their disposition, and making sure that their due process rights are intact, and making sure that the process goes smoothly and swiftly, and that we are making the best decisions we can make along the way. Both pilot sites have experienced significant reductions in their detention populations. And when I say significant, at least cut in half. Right now in both sites, there's parts of the buildings that are completely empty. That's not a bad thing. But neither detention center is going to close either, because there are those kids that make their way up to detention. And so we need detention as an option, but it's just not an appropriate option for all of the kids that we were using it for, historically speaking. Both sites have experienced an increase in fiscal support, partly because of the decrease in the numbers, but also because they being the counties, have seen that JDAI works. It's not just one of those things that come in for a year and leave at the end of the year. They've seen a increase in the support, they've seen an increase in the positive experiences that are going on, and they haven't seen a huge issue with crime rates increasing because there's not any kids in detention. Both sites have also experienced a more effective police process, and I'll go into that here shortly. They've also seen a visible reduction in the Department of Corrections commitments as well. And that's actually something that they didn't even focus on. It's just because there's fewer kids that are going through the court system and getting on probation, then there's fewer kids that are also going to Department of Corrections. That's something that's just kind of a bonus for both sites to experience. Here's the 8 core strategies of JDAI. You can't just pick and choose. You have to do all 8 core strategies. And the reason why collaboration is the biggest is because every single one of the 8 core strategies starts and ends with collaboration and communication. You have to have the right people around the table. You have to have the respect for people to be able to have those tough discussions. JDAI is not an easy process to go through, nor is it swift and quick. It is a long process, and it's taken both sides 3 years to show that it works. So that is what made allowed the UJS to take it off, is because they were able to see that demonstrated, not only data, but the anecdotal evidence as well. The next 8 core strategy, that the biggest, is the data-driven decision. Now, the first process that happens with JDAI is to do a detention utilization study, because JDAI is not about every single kid in the whole community. It's about the kids that are sitting in detention unnecessarily, and where detention is unnecessarily used as a sanction or as a dispositional option, one of those things. So you have to base your decision on data. You have to know what kind of kids are in detention first before you can identify what programming you might want to implement. The same with the programs. We are such a small state that you can't create an entire program for 5 kids. You're never going to have any nonprofit open up an entire program for 5 kids. You have to make it make sense. And you have to kind of prove that you need to have those changes before you move forward. The objective admissions, that is basically, it's called a risk assessment instrument. It is taking the personal thought out of making an intake decision. Now, an intake in South Dakota is given by the presiding judge to a lay magistrate. In Minnehaha and Pennington County, their detention center staff are actually the lay magistrate. In Pennington County, they also have additional staff who run one of the alternative programs that completes the intake as well. That's been assigned as a lay magistrate. But that's also going to be different throughout the state, because you have smaller jurisdictions where you might have the courts that are lay magistrates. So you'll have to be a little more creative. The risk assessment instrument, since its inception, has been a statewide document. It's based on South Dakota codified law. It's based on what makes sense for these kids. And hopefully, by having it being utilized throughout the whole state, it eliminates that justice by geography. So if a kid comes into contact with law enforcement in Minnehaha County, they're going to be treated the same way as they do in Pennington County, or Hughes County, or Brown County, or any of the other counties across the state. And so it helps align the practice with what's already written in South Dakota codified law. And so we're just gaining compliance with that law. And the whole entire risk assessment instrument is based on youth's risk to commit a new offense and the risk to not go to court. And the risk assessment instrument, the whole time frame for it is from the time the kid comes into contact with law enforcement until their temporary custody hearing or detention hearing. So sometimes that's most of the time it's less than 48 hours. It should be less than 48 hours. So you're not talking about a whole long length of time. You're talking about that immediate risk to that kid not show up at court and to fail to appear. And also above and beyond everything else, community safety. There's an override option to this risk assessment instrument because none of the people on the team that created the document were naive enough to think that these kids fit into a pretty little document. There's always those outside cases that you have, and that will always happen. But any KC Foundation likes to have the override rate at least below 12%, and both sides have been pretty successful in doing that. The alternatives to detention, an alternative doesn't have to be a program. It could be house arrest. Both sides have also used what's called a conditional release agreement, and this is basically house arrest and having the kids go to detention the next day. The youth and the parent signs an agreement saying, I will show up at detention hearings, but I also get to go to sleep in my own bed, and I also get to go to school, which is probably one of the issues that's going on. So if we have them stay in detention, sometimes they don't go to school, which just exacerbates the issues. So the conditional release agreement is something that was a really positive implementation. And again, all the alternatives need to be based on data and what that tells you. At one of the national conferences, I heard about just an anecdotal discussion and a story. And one of the, I can't remember now what he was doing, but he's been doing JDI for quite a long time. He said when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. So that's very true to these kids. If you only have secure detention, then every kid looks like they fit in secure detention. And so by looking at the kids in the situation at a more broader scale and looking more creatively, then you're able to identify what the options are available. The case processing reform is probably the largest and most impactful change that has been made, and the main change has been ensuring that the kids aren't lagging in court. This happens by the implementation of a placement coordinator for expedited. Now, on both sites, they're called different things because, of course, there's the east versus west, and nobody can be the same. And so in Minnehaha County, their person is called a placement coordinator, and in Pennington County, theirs is called a for expedited. Their whole goal is for every single kid that on that objective risk assessment instrument scores for an alternative or higher and needs a detention hearing, they gather additional information. They contact the parents. They talk to the youth. They have federal contacts with the Department of Corrections, Department of Social Services, court services if the kids are working with those agencies. They also talk to the schools. They've had conversations with the school liaison officers, which are really helpful because those school liaison officers in those schools are working with these kids and experiencing them every day. So they know more about these kids than most people do. If there's a counselor involved, if there's anyone else that's important involved, they make those collateral contacts, put that information into a document, and send that out to all that attends the daily staffing. The daily staffing is a very, very interesting and amazing process to look and to watch. It has the state's attorney, the public defender, any alternative programming that is implemented in the site. We've had law enforcement officers show up. We've had school personnel show up. Department of Corrections, Department of Social Services, court services shows up. All of these people help make this decision on what's the best interest for this kid from the time of the temporary custody hearing until their advisory hearing, which for the most part is about 2 weeks. And so you're looking at what is this kid's life going to look like? Do they need to be on an ankle monitor? Do they need to be held in secure detention? Are they more appropriate for shelter care? Or can we just straight release them and not have any further involvement at all? One of the really amazing things that's also hasn't happened is identifying kids that are working with the Department of Social Services right away. The kids that are working with any agency. Because historically speaking, there was kids that would go in front of a judge, in front of a juvenile judge, and nobody knew they had a DSS worker. Nobody knew they had a DOC agent. And so their case would lag and lag and lag. And until the point when the court service officer was ready to make their recommendations at the advisory hearing, that's when we would find all of these things out. The same with anything that's how they're doing in school, all of those things. We can make that immediate decision at the very, very beginning of a case and appoint a defense attorney. That's having the defense attorney there, whether they're advocating specifically for that kid and go interview that kid, or just wear the advocate hat around the table, that's huge and that's beneficial. And these kids are benefiting from that because the decision is not just one person or two people making this decision. It's a whole group of people. And the parent has a say and the kid has a say. So by the time the staffing is completed, they either come up with a final recommendation as a whole, or some of them might not agree. When you have a state's attorney and a public defender, that sometimes doesn't work well to get to one decision, but at least everybody can come to the judge and present their case, knowing all of the facts, and everybody is on the same even playing field. The judges have actually really enjoyed this process and really embrace it. Some judges request the documents, some don't. Some just trust that the process is working and that the discussion was held and are able to make a decision from there. The whole purpose of another task of the court expedited placement coordinator position is to have 2-week reviews. And that is to make sure that the kids aren't lagging in detention or lagging in court or unnecessary additional hearings, review hearings, etc. South Dakota really didn't have that issue, but it's nice to kind of shore up some of the things that were going on. Some JDI sites had the whole process from law enforcement contact to disposition last 4 to 5 months. I don't think that happens unless it's a really severe case in South Dakota for a very long time. But we can typically dispose of a case within less than 30 days, unless there's extenuating circumstances, because of that 2-week review. And because that kid in that story is on everybody's mind every 2 weeks, and you're not only thinking about just a piece of paper, you're thinking about just a case, you're thinking about the kid's life and what they're experiencing and how can we